morning to you. It is a pleasure to have you on board. The show is Good Morning Africa. My name is Miriam Ogutu, and it is Monday, the 21st of November 2022. I trust that you had a wonderful weekend, and today being a Monday, I do have so much to catch us up to date with. And so, a very good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're joining and tuned in and watching us from. We are coming to you all the way from Kenya's capital here in Nairobi. So before we get into our topic of today, remember the COP27 just concluded in Egypt, so we shall see what really happened there, some of the wins and or hits or misses, and what took place, and the last agreement that was heard. We shall go through that and see what Africa stands to gain and what really happened there, and also details of that agreement. But before that, I'd like to bring us up to date with the latest headlines. I'll start with that, and then I'll go to the news, and then we shall come to that topic. I'll start by going through the leading newspapers here in Kenya. The Star newspaper, IEBC 4 petitions, a tough road ahead. Cherera, Masit, Wanderi, Nyang'aya have date with MP starting Thursday. The story is on page 4 and 5 on the Star newspaper. Body of Kenyan woman arrives home in Kisii from Lebanon. That is on page 3. And of course, the main pictorial is pomp and color as Qatar World Cup kicks off. Fans are seen inside the stadium before the Group A match between host Qatar and Ecuador at the 2022 FIFA World Cup at Al Bayt Stadium in Al Khor in Qatar yesterday. And of course, it was not a very good start off there for the host country, Qatar having lost 2-1 to Ecuador, in fact making history as one of the host countries that have lost since the start of this World Cup in the opening match. Not quite a good start. So hopefully Qatar will have to do better in the next subsequent matches. Life after whatever cost, why cancer patients prefer treatment in India. That story is on page 2. MPs seek hefty perks for serving single term in new proposed law. They've not even settled down. These people are quite a disservice to the people of Kenya, but I guess we just get the leaders that we deserve, right? Okay, that story is on page 6 on the Star newspaper. And then we look at the Standard newspaper, the main headline, Raila, Ruto, a puppet of Western forces, opposition leader says foreign powers are pushing the president to import GMO foods regardless of the health risks involved. He says while other countries are banning the foods, the government is exposing Kenyans to harm. The story is on page 6, and of course the main pictorial is football bonanza with special coverage on pages 38, 39 and 40 on the Standard newspaper on the World Cup. And of course, part of that, the Standard has just featured the opening ceremony of the 2022 Qatar FIFA World Cup. Okay. Reduce parent CBC workload task force told. Parents are really not excited about some of these homeworks that they have to do, or they have to get involved and help their kids do as far as the CBC curriculum is concerned. So they're saying, could you reduce part of that work that we must do as parents, that involvement that is required of us by this new curriculum? That story is on page 10. Remember, this team is going around the country and is getting, opinions from stakeholders from across the country, parents, and anybody who can make their way to where these sittings are happening. I think it's very, very important for people who are concerned to go and just give their thoughts on how the CBC can be bettered. Because I think from what we heard, even from this new government, CBC has to stay. They will not scrape it off. They will only work to make it better. And of course, stakeholders have been invited to go and give their opinion on how this can be made better for the sake of our children and improving our education system. Okay, so if you can find your way there to this task force, find your way there and give your opinion. Hustler Fund unperked. Okay, that story is on page 4 and 5. A real reason Kenya sent troops to DRC. That is an analysis piece on page 14 and 15. Rich nations to pay for climate change distraction. We shall look at that when we shall be looking at that topic. That story is on page 13. On the Standard, the Daily Nation, storm over GMOs. Opposition. Azimio leader Raila Odinga once planned to import GMO maize halted even as he challenges the government to make available scientific studies it relied on to lift ban on genetically modified organisms and ask legislators to lead debate on the grave matter. The story is on page 2 and 3. Miners lack how youngest Kenyan in East Africa Legislative Assembly bounced back. That story is on page 4. COP27 hits and misses, no deal on emissions, but parties agree to set up loss and damage fund. That story is on page 8. And just a reminder, that will be our topic of discussion in just a bit. A dead man walking, he was first declared dead, then sacked after Joseph Kiprono's wife was asked to provide details and the necessary documents so that his employer could process his death, gratuity and benefits. It took him 4 years to prove he was alive. That's a very interesting read. You'll find that on page 12. On the Daily Nation, Ecuador hit Qatar, Senegal on parade. Valencia scores the first goal of the tournament from the sport as the South Americans win Group A opener 2-0. Today, African champion Senegal play the Netherlands from 7 p.m. and I think that is a match to watch. That story, special coverage is on page 37, 38 and 39 on the Daily Nation. Let's now just focus on some of the regional newspapers and The Guardian from Nigeria. Next government to inherit 71.5 trillion naira debts and liabilities after May 29th. That is the main headline. The Nation also from Nigeria. 2023 G5 governors allies to sustain anti-Atiku moves. That is what we have there. The Daily Monitor from Uganda. Government considers Christmas travel ban over Ebola. All right. New Vision, also from Uganda. EAC leaders issue ultimatum on M23. There has been some interesting developments. I haven't been here for a while, but I'm sure you've been brought up to date with what has been happening, but there has been some very interesting development as far as this conflict in the Democratic Republic of Congo is concerned. The Namibian, of course, from Namibia, Windhoek's Reach don't want informal traders, claim their health and safety risk. Interesting. The Sun, also from Namibia, Lutombi ready for huge city responsibility. A Newsday, this is from Zimbabwe, AD attacked over coup. And then Chronicle, just trying to find out where this is from. Okay, but child sexual abuse, government re-examines approaches. I think from Bulawayo, this has to be in also Zimbabwe. The Citizen from Tanzania, which way for betting? And Mwananchi also from Tanzania, ni mtifuano wenye viti CCM mikoa. Don't ask me to translate, but that is what the headline says. So that is just some of the newspapers from across the region. So now I'd like for us to just bring us up to date with some news from also a detailed news from the continent, just a few items and what has been happening from over the weekend. And we start with Equatorial Guinea, which, by the way, I'll bring a special focus later on in the afternoon on Equatorial Guinea. We know the sitting head of state there is the longest serving head of state in Africa, so I shall bring you that in a detailed show later on. But vote counting right now is underway in Equatorial Guinea, an election where the world's longest serving president is seeking a re-election to extend his 43 years in office. First results are not expected until today. At the earliest, the AFP News agency has reported President Teodoro Obiang Nguema Basogo, who is now 80, has banned all opposition parties except for one. Equatorial Guinea does not have close elections. The president usually wins with at least 93% of the votes and is widely predicted to happen again. It helps that he has banned almost all opposition parties and the media is controlled by the state. At the president's age, there had been speculation that his son, Teodorin, would be taking over. He's been convicted in France for funding a lavish lifestyle using public money from his country. It is a major oil producer, but there's little prospect of the money lifting people out of poverty. Equatorial Guinea has one of the world's most corrupt and repressive governments. And just to add to that, the vice president is also the son of the president. Okay. The leaders of French-speaking countries have held a summit on the Tunisian island of Djerba to discuss growing instability in French-speaking African countries. The head of the group, Louise Mushikiwabo, said there were long debates about the main conflict zones. She said the group could support and quicken efforts to mediate between parties in conflict. The Prime Minister of the Democratic Republic of Congo, Jean-Michel Sama Lukonde, refused to pose for a group photo next to the Rwandan President Paul Kagame. Kinshasa has accused him of supporting M23 rebels fighting in Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. Rwanda has always denied these allegations. United Nations officials announced on Friday a second shipment of Russian fertilizer will go to West Africa after a first attempt was blocked in European ports because of sanctions imposed due to the conflict in Ukraine. The move follows talks between Moscow and the United Nations. Secretary General of the UN's Trade and Development Agency, UNCTAD, Rebecca Ginspan, told journalists there were around 300,000 tons of fertilizer in different European ports. As part of the implementation of the two agreements signed on the 22nd of July this year in Istanbul, to ensure unhindered access to food and fertilizer from Ukraine and Russia, the World Food Programme earlier announced it will facilitate the donation of 260,000 tons of fertilizer by the Russian fertilizer company and to the neediest countries in Africa, with Malawi as its first destination. Gunmen attacked an army base and a town in northwest Nigeria, killing 9 soldiers, 2 policemen and civilians, security sources and residents said on Sunday in the latest violence in the region. Riding in trucks fitted with machine guns, the fighters suspected to be members of the Islamic State of West Africa province, ISWAP, stormed the town of Malam Fatori in Abadan district late Friday and early Saturday, they said. The attack happened near the Niger border, came at dusk Friday, leading to a fierce battle with soldiers who repelled the assault, said a resident from that area. In a pre-dawn attack on the base and the town on Saturday, the jihadists threw explosives and killed residents, while others drowned in a river while trying to flee. 2 security sources said on Sunday that 9 soldiers and 2 policemen were killed in the base attack. And a media watchdog in Somalia says the government is pressuring one of its leaders to stop criticizing authorities. Abdallah Ahmed Mumin, Secretary General of Somali Journalist Syndicate SJS, is out on bail after 2 arrests in October for what officials call security-related charges. But the SJS alleges that the Ministry of Information representatives approached it with an offer to drop those charges on the condition that Mumin cease his media advocacy and avoid future criticism of the authorities. SJS said the ministry also demanded that the association apologize and agree to abide by an October 8th directive banning the dissemination of content from Al-Shabaab. A ministry official denied that any such conversation ever took place. We head over to South Sudan, and the United States ambassador to South Sudan has encouraged young people to use the power of music and art to break ethnic barriers and unite the country. Michael J. Adler says the youth should dedicate themselves to influencing positive change and creating a better future for the country. Ambassador Adler made the remarks on the commemoration of Daniel Pearl World Music Day on the weekend. The diplomat said the U.S. is implementing a $45 million youth empowerment initiative over the next 4 years in South Sudan. The program, targeting 25,000 youth and 65 national youth organizations, will provide mentorship on civic engagement, reproductive health, and social community cohesion. A coalition of leading Ugandan rights groups and lawyers on Thursday filed a case in court challenging a controversial new internet law which they say is aimed at curbing free speech and targeting government opponents. The amendment to the Computer Misuse Act, signed into law by Ugandan President Yoweri Museveni last month, has been criticized by Amnesty International, which has called for the draconian legislation to be scrapped. 9 rights groups, a former leader of the opposition in parliament, and 3 prominent lawyers lodged the petition at the Constitutional Court on Thursday. the second court challenge to the law. The petitioners, which include Chapter 4, Uganda's most prominent rights group, say the law regulates online behavior in a vague and ambiguous manner. Amnesty has noted the new legislation contains some useful provisions such as the right to privacy and responsible coverage of children, but added that it introduces punitive penalties for anyone accused of so-called hate speech. People convicted under the law are barred from the holding public office for 10 years, which Amnesty warned was a way of reinforcing state control over online freedom of expression, including by political opposition groups. Offenders also face fines of up to 15 million Ugandan shillings, which is an equivalent to $3,900 and prison terms of up to 7 years. Okay, and then we end our news from South Africa, and the country's power utility Eskom has run out of money to buy diesel for its critical plants, according to the Minister of Public Enterprises. It means people will experience rolling blackouts up to 6 hours a day. In a statement, Minister Pravin Gordhan said that his department will be working with the National Treasury to find money to buy supplies of diesel. Mr. Gordhan met with the Eskom board on Sunday night and called for exceptional interventions to create more reliability in power supply. Eskom is constrained by a massive $26 billion debt and has old, inefficient power stations that require constant work to keep them running. And that is the latest news from across the continent of Africa. A very good morning to you. I see I'm joined this morning by Wanda Wesonga from Nairobi. Wanda, a very good morning to you. Wanda,
good morning. Good morning, Miriam. It has been a while since I last saw you. I'm happy to see you. I've gone through, listening to all the news in the Kenya and across the continent and the world. Which I'm happy, at least as a continent, as a country, we are going somewhere. So at least I'm very happy to see you this morning.
All right, I'm happy to have you, and I'm glad to be back. I was on a short break, but I'm back, and I'm happy to be back, and nice to have you on the show. Now, before we get into the main topic, which is the just concluded COP27 in Egypt, there's this story that perhaps I'd like to get your thoughts on, and that is that the leaders of French-speaking countries held a summit on the Tunisian island of Djerba, and they were discussing the instability across Africa, especially in the French-speaking African countries. And of course, a country like Democratic Republic of Congo was present, and Rwanda was also present. Okay. All right, and Rwanda. Sorry. It's a bit noisy. All right. Okay. We apologize for that. Issues with technology and sometimes remote working can be challenging. All right. So they had a meeting. These French leaders from the French-speaking countries across Africa, they had a meeting, and of course they were discussing the problem and the conflicts that we've seen across countries in Africa, especially the French-speaking countries. So what I'm just wondering, because the DRC and Rwanda also are there. They're French speaking. So they were part of that meeting. So I'm assuming even this conflict of the Democratic Republic of Congo must have been discussed there. I was just wondering, why are they meeting as French speaking bloc to discuss the instability in Africa? Why must we meet under such construct, while we very well know, for instance, the conflict in the Democratic Republic of Congo is not only affecting the French-speaking countries within the continent, but it is a problem now that has drawn all of us in. So why are they meeting under such a construct and not just meet leadership across Africa, just meet to discuss and find solutions over an African problem with an African approach, instead of working under the construct of French speaking? Because I don't know what solutions they're looking to have on that bloc. Well, we know very well that the East African community now is leading the mediation process under the leaders we have to find a solution in, say, this conflict that has been ongoing in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So will these other factors perhaps come into play and might be a problem in and perhaps might even derail the efforts that already are being made as far as finding a solution, for instance, in this conflict in the Democratic Republic of Congo?
One, when you look into the Francophone or the French-speaking nation and what is happening in DRC Congo, the struggle to, that process of trying to find a solution to the conflict in Congo, it puts France in a very awkward position that they will not want to be. Like the other day, if you can, we saw President Kagame meeting with the France president, of which that push to find a solution or a long-lasting solution to the conflict in Congo brings, it raises a lot of unanswered questions to France. Are we losing our control in Africa? Because of recent, we have had a number of African countries, or rather, we have had a move in Africa where a number of Pan-Africanists want to see Africa as a peaceful nation, of which most of the problems that we normally face as a continent, quite a good number of them rotates around the France, former colonies. Therefore, yes, we should have our own discussions and that we structure on our own end, that we only discuss what is happening in Africa, what should we do as Africans. But insofar as French colonies, the former French colonies are concerned, France is a country seated not so sure of what tomorrow has for us in store. Therefore, such kind of meetings where we go ahead and discuss, or structure to discuss what is happening in former French colonies, it is something that in one way or the other, French could be involved in it, or France are not so sure of what is going to happen to them tomorrow. Because if M23 are now ready to have a sitting and discuss the conflict in DRC Congo, and as well the two presidents, Tshisekedi and Paul Kagame, are equally ready to cease fire and have a discussion, then it tells you that probably Africa is on our wake, and any foreign power involved in this will not sit happy, because probably they stand a chance to lose one or two things. Therefore, Africa's problem in a bigger percentage revolves around or rotates around the French colonies. Therefore, any kind of discussion on what is happening in Africa, especially in terms of peace and security, the former French colonies will always have a key front, or rather the front seat, to be discussed.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much. And I'm just wondering, before we get into our main topic, of course, you've reminded us about a meeting that the French President Emmanuel Macron had with some of these leaders, I think Rwanda's leader and also some other leaders from the French-speaking countries. I don't know if there's a possibility. I can't really ascertain that perhaps France is behind this meeting, but there could be a very high possibility that France actually has sponsored this meeting, but that is not what I'm saying this morning. And so is it perhaps a way of France reinforcing its presence in the continent, especially in its former colonies, which we know lately has been challenged? We've seen the acrimonious relationship it has with Algeria right now, and Algeria is even trying to change its currency and include some wordings there in English, and France is not very happy about it. They even had a session in French Parliament to discuss an African currency, which I found to be very absurd. And also we've seen that tumultuous relationship relationship in Mali and also in the Central African Republic. So is France trying to reinforce its presence? And perhaps this is just when you hear such meetings of French-speaking countries holding such summits, it's just a disguise. It is just France being France. As we know, France has been having a lot of control over its former colonies, and of course that position has been challenged. So are they just trying to reinstate their presence, or they're actually looking out to find a solution for this problem?
France will never want to find a solution to problems that are happening in Africa, because from the word go, France was never ready, or France didn't want to walk out from Africa. Therefore, when you look into the 1945 formation of Organization of Africa, national, that is UNO, organization of, generally the UNO. Therefore, when you look into the formation of UNO and the struggle to see into it that African continent is now let free, that we are now a free continent, free from political and economic oppression, social oppression. France was not so ready to let go of Africa. Therefore, you as well look into the number of foreign soldiers, army that are in Africa. France tops in that list of a country that has so many soldiers in Africa. Therefore, when Africa tries to awaken, France will feel threatened. France still controls a bit of Africa's economy. Therefore, if they see into it that Africa wants to stand on her feet, Africa is taking a different direction from what they are used to. Believe me, know that France, from where they are seated, feels threat, feels that heat, the pressure. And they want to do everything possible so that they still control, they still have at least a control in Africa's politics and economy. Therefore, France will never want to see a peaceful Africa as a continent, because they still control our politics, they still control our economy, and they're not control in the sense that they want Africa to grow, but they control in the sense that they want to manipulate Africa's economy. Therefore, yes, France is having a hand, could be having a hand in such meetings. And yes, they're having a hand in these meetings, not to see into it that peace is finally realized in Africa, but they're having a hand in it so that they'll continue manipulating Africa's economy.
Okay. All right. Very well, Wanda, thank you. And I'm being asked here by production if perhaps you can move to a more quieter place. I don't know if you're able to do that so that we can have a quality broadcast. There seems to be a lot of background noise there, but if you can, then that's fine. After days of intense negotiations that stretched into early Sunday morning in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, countries at the latest UN Climate Change Conference, COP27, reached an agreement on an outcome that established a funding mechanism to compensate vulnerable nations for loss and damage from climate-induced disasters. A historic deal has been struck at the UN's COP27 summit that, as I said, they will see the richer countries pay poorer countries for the damage and economic losses caused by the climate change. It ends almost 30 years of waiting by nations facing huge climate impacts, but developed nations are left dissatisfied over progress on cutting fossil fuels. This year, talks in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt came close to a collapse and overran by 2 days. Lukewarm applause met the historic moment. The loss and damage fund was agreed in the early hours of Sunday, as a confusing and often chaotic 48 hours left delegates exhausted. It is, though, a huge symbolic and political statement from developed nations that long resisted a fund that covers climate impact like flooding and drought. The summit began 2 weeks ago with powerful statements from vulnerable nations saying that they will not give up, and the alternative consigns the countries to a watery grave. That is what Bahamas Prime Minister Philip Davis said. On Sunday, Pakistan's climate Climate Minister Sherry Rehman, who negotiated for the bloc of developing countries plus China, told journalists she was very happy with the agreement. Now, the devastating floods in at-risk nation Pakistan this summer, which killed about 1,700 people with estimated damages of 40 billion US dollars, have been a powerful backdrop at this summit. On Sunday, Antigua and Bermuda Environment Minister Maureen Joseph Anchia of the Alliance of Small Island States said the deal was a win for the entire world and restored global faith in this critical process dedicated to ensuring no one is left behind. But nations and groups including UK, EU and New Zealand left Egypt unhappy with compromises on fossil fuels and curbing climate change. Countries that fought to weaken the ambition to rapidly cut greenhouse gas emissions, gases that warm the planet, need to look at risks nations in the eye. That is what UK lead negotiator Alok Sharma told journalists. And of course, UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak welcomed the progress made at COP27, but said more must be done to tackle climate change. Now, the final overarching deal did not include commitments to phase down or reduce use of fossil fuels. It also included ambiguous new language about low emissions energy, which experts say could open the door to some fossil fuels being considered as part of a green energy. So the agreement of reduction, let's just start from there. The last meetings they've heard and the last agreements that they've made, the Paris Agreement, and then followed by the agreement that was made last year to reduce, the emissions, these harmful emissions. And it was agreed upon that every country should make an effort to reduce that to about 1.5 degrees Celsius. But now they seem to be dancing around this issue. And these countries are fighting to reduce, these emissions, and they don't want to commit to this. But this is something that was agreed upon several years ago. Why do you think that is so? And then the countries that, of course, some of which are the highest producers of these dangerous emissions, are the ones who left that meeting very unhappy with some of the concessions that they had to make. Why do you think this is the case?
Any discussion on climate change will always end not with all parties happy with it, because this is a meeting where you're pointing a finger at a person or at a country, telling them you are the problem, you are the guys that are leading to all these challenges that you're facing. Therefore, when you look into the more industrialized countries, chances are such countries that are competing economic-wise and using the industries as a way to compete will always walk out from such meetings either not happy, or they will either want to walk out in the midway of the meetings. Therefore, therefore, the reasoning behind all this is because no one is ready to sit down and have a candid discussion on how do we still promote our economy. And with looking into the climate change issues, you also look into the Africa as a continent. We are also not sincere with what is happening, because we in one way or the other, yes, not so much in industrial emissions, but we are not so good in protecting the environment, taking care of the forest cover. Therefore, as I yield the mic, the meeting on anything to do with the climate change will never, we'll never have all the parties at peace, because these guys are competing economic-wise, and their way of competing economic-wise is addressed with the industry, the industrial production. Therefore, the industrial production comes in with the emissions, of which these emissions, no one is addressing them. No one is addressing on how they compete economic-wise without having a danger on climate.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so just a bit of a background for us to understand how far even some of these agreements and some of these commitments or lack thereof of a lot of countries come from. So since, let me just take us just a little back there. So the COPs are the biggest and most important annual meetings, of course, as far as climate-related conference is concerned. And in 1992, the UN organized the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, in which the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC, was adopted in its coordinating agency, and we know now as the UN Climate Change Secretariat was put in place. In this treaty, nations agreed to stabilize greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere to prevent dangerous interference from human activity on the climate system. So far, 197 parties have signed it. And since 1994, when the treaty entered into force every year, the UN has been bringing together almost every country on Earth for Global Climate Summit, or COPs, which stands for Conference of Parties. During these meetings, nations have negotiated various extensions of the regional treaty to establish legally binding limits on emissions, for example, the Kyoto Protocol of 1997 and the Paris Agreement adopted in 2015, in which all countries of the world agreed to step up efforts to try and limit global warming to at least 1.5 degrees Celsius. That was the agreement. Above pre-industrial temperatures and boost climate action financing. And so this year was the 27th annual summit, and that's why it was called the COP27. Now, last year's COP26, which marked 5 years since the signing of the Paris Agreement, 1 year was skipped because of the COVID-19 pandemic, culminated in the Glasgow Climate Pact, which kept the goal of curbing global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius alive, but with week past, as then UK presidency declared. And so at COP26, countries agreed to deliver stronger commitments, including updated national plans with more ambitious targets. However, until this year's COP27, only 23 out of the 193 countries had already submitted their plans to the UN so far. So, of course, that went to show the lack of commitment in a lot of these countries that are signatory to this very important, body. And so we've seen that agreement, the global curbing, the global warming curbing to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So that has been something that countries have been pushing for, especially the developing countries, which are as far as emissions of these fuels at the lowest. We don't emit much, but instead we get affected so much with what is happening in the developed world. So as the clock ticked and this year's COP27, richer nations appear to concede despite a last-minute intervention by Switzerland. Expectations were low at the beginning of COP27, and it was meant to be an action summit that implemented agreements made last year, and I think I've gone through some of those agreements. But what we've seen is not because now they've created this other moment, what they're calling a loss and damage fund. As much as this looks like a win to try to fund the climate change initiatives, especially in the developing world, but this was not part of what was agreed upon. They were supposed to be to implement agreements that were made last year, but instead they came up with something new. So I don't know if this, of course, goes to show the lack of commitment by this nation, but by them not really paying attention to some of the agreements that they made in last year's meeting at COP26 and the previous agreements that this year was meant to see these countries implement, or at least find a way to implement. But instead, they've brushed that aside and decided, no, we are not going to talk about the emissions there and how many degrees Celsius we had agreed upon. Let's now just put up a loss and damage fund. So talk to me about the commitment of these countries.
In terms of commitment, this is like someone going to a shower room in ice cold water, that you open the shower, then you keep dodging the waters. They run down, you dodge them. Therefore, these guys knows they know the commitment that was there. Probably they never obeyed it. They never stood to what they planned, the initial plans. Therefore, instead of going to a meeting where they'll point a finger at each other, they'll start complaining at each other, or you suppose you're the one who is probably considered as the senior, the bosses, then you're the one seen to be on the forefront, not living by the agreement. Therefore, in such grounds, such bosses or such nations will now want to walk out from the initial plans. Therefore, the reasoning behind not wanting to commit or to commit themselves on what they had prior agreed is on ground that nothing much has been done. Because you look at the more industrialized nations, such nations, when it comes to climate change, they'll never want to, or the climate change and the global warming issues, they'll never want to sit on a discussion table where the plan was put. Then they have a proper analysis of how far have we gone as a continent or as a continent, as a world. Therefore, yes, they do. I mean, chances are they do want to commit themselves to what they initially agreed, based on the ground that they realized nothing much was done, and probably there were the reasoning behind nothing much being done.
All right. Okay, so of course the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres said in a video message issued from the conference venue in Egypt, and this is what he said, just part of it. This COP has taken an important step towards justice. I welcome the decision to establish a loss and damage fund and to operationalize it in the coming period. And he went to underscore that the voices of those on front lines of the climate crisis must be heard. The UN chief was referring to what ended up becoming the thorniest issue of this COP, shorthand for the annual conference of parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. Now, developing countries made strong and repeated appeals for the establishment of a loss and damage fund, which I think looks like a win, to compensate the countries that are the most vulnerable to climate disasters yet who have contributed little to the climate crisis. And so just part of what he said, clearly this will not be enough. We all know that. But it is a much needed political signal to rebuild broken trust, he underscored, stressing that the UN system will support the efforts every step of the way. Ahead of the action of the text, COP27, President Sameh Shoukry, who is also the Foreign Affairs Minister of Egypt, told delegations that the draft decisions were a gateway that will scale up implementation and will enable us to transform to future of climate, future neutrality and climate resilient development. And so all right, so the UN Secretary General thinks this is quite a good deal, and Mr. Guterres reminded the world of what remain the priorities regarding the climate action, including the ambition to reduce global greenhouse gas emissions, keep alive the Paris Agreement, which nobody talked about, to at least 1.5 degrees Celsius limit, and pull humanity back from climate cliff. He also reiterated the importance of changing the business models of multilateral development banks and international financial institutions, and he said they must accept more risk and systematically leverage private finance for developing countries to reasonable cost, he said. So I think the greatest win, I think that takeaway from this meeting was the establishment of loss and damage fund. This is, I think, one of the. So let me just, perhaps explain to us what this means. This human-induced climate change, including more frequent and intense extreme events, has caused widespread adverse impacts and related losses and damages to nature and people beyond natural climate variability. Some development and adaptation efforts have reduced vulnerability, but the rise in weather and climate extremes has led to some irreversible impacts as the natural and human systems are pushed beyond their ability to adapt. Loss and damage arising from the adverse effects of climate change can include those related. So this fund is meant to cover some of these extreme weather events, but also slow onset events such as sea level rise, increasing temperatures, ocean acidification, glacial retreat and related impacts, salinization, land and forest degradation, loss of biodiversity, and desertification. Acknowledging the loss and damage includes, and some cases involves more than what which can be reduced by adaptation. Now, COP19 that happened years ago established the Warsaw International Mechanism for Loss and Damage. So this is something that was established at the COP19 years back, and I think there was not an agreement to what extent this fund, which now has become into effect, would cover, some countries which have had devastating natural calamities like flooding and things like that, have been pushing for this fund also to consider such matters as far as funding on climate action is concerned. So since then, it has been serving as the main catalyzer under the UNFCCC process for enhancing knowledge, coherence, and action in support to avert, minimize, and address loss and damage associated with climate change impacts in developing countries that are particularly vulnerable to the adverse effects of climate change. In the broadest understanding, all efforts being taken to curb the global average temperature increase and to adapt to the adverse effects of climate change can contribute to preventing, reducing the risk of loss and damages associated with climate change borne by societies and individuals. Now, Article 8 of the Paris Agreement enshrines the importance of averting, minimizing, and addressing. So this fund is meant to address, this. If there are measures that can be put in place to avert some of these climatic extreme conditions that the world is experiencing, especially in the developing world. So this fund is meant to also do that. And averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage, and the role of sustainable development in reducing the risk of loss and damage. It identifies the following areas of cooperation and facilitation to enhance understanding, action, and support with regard to loss and damage. So these are just some of the things that now this new fund, that was established. That decision was reached after quite a tussle there, the COP27. They established a loss and damage fund. So this loss and damage fund, let me just take us through what perhaps it will cover. Early warning systems. It's supposed to fund, such emergency preparedness, slow onset events that may involve irreversible and permanent loss and damage, comprehensive risk assessment and management, risk insurance facilities, climate risk pooling and other insurance solutions, non-economic losses, and resilience of communities, livelihoods, and ecosystems, as synthesized by the IPCC. The latest science, of course, tells us that near-term actions that limit global warming to close to 1.5 degrees Celsius would sustainably reduce projected losses and damages related to climate change in human systems and ecosystems, but cannot eliminate them all. And so that has been a contentious issue. And last year, and also the previous agreements, as much as this loss and damage fund is something that perhaps some countries have been pushing for, and the compensation that developing countries have been asking, especially those from Africa, the main agreement and the main contentious issues is to push the world to at least limit global warming to close to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And this was based on science. And according to science, if we can limit our activities as far as global warming is concerned to at least close to 1.5 degrees Celsius, this will reduce in the long term some of these projected losses. But these countries will not hear this. Of course, the highest emitters have been fighting this. So this never featured so much in the talks of COP27. So I don't know, by them setting up this, fund, this will help, or I don't know if they were just trying to not address the issue of the global warming and